Becoming a Bible Nerd. We are on chapter 18. We are getting closer and closer to Jesus' death on the cross, and this is the start of it all. So in chapter 18, it starts off by saying, after Jesus had said these things, and we are talking about the things he said from chapter 13 through 17 to his disciples on that last night that he had together with them. It says that he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Couple of things. This Kidron Valley is a valley in the Middle East. You have mountains and valleys, and these valleys were called wadis, and they were dry 90% of the year, but when a flood came, these valleys would be rushed with water that would be going so fast it could kill you. But most of the time they were dry creek beds that flowed, and it made it easy for travel across the land. People would travel through the wadis or through the valleys, and this Kidron Valley was one that ran north-south between the Temple Mount. So if you actually go onto the Temple Mount, if you're ever in Israel to experience where the temple once was, now it's a mosque looking thing that is occupied by Palestinians, and it's heart-wrenching, but you're allowed to go up there, and if you're up at the top and you look across, you see the Mount of Olives, and there's a valley that runs between, and this is the Kidron Valley. It was where all of the blood from the feast when there were sacrifices ran. In fact, this Passover season that we're entering in right now in chapter 18 is the bloodiest of all of the feast. Every head of the household in Israel, head of the family, would have to go into Jerusalem during this festival, and they would have either purchased or brought with them a perfect and spotless lamb to be slaughtered for the festival. And each of these lambs would have about 3 gallons of blood in them, and when they would be sacrificed, the priest would pour the blood over the altar. And so this is happening. It's just not like you're in one long line with one priest. There are priests line up through the temple, and this altar is massive, and just one after another throughout the day they are slaughtering the lambs and pouring the blood over the altar. And then there was a drainage system where the blood would go down and then flow out into the Kidron Valley, and it would just be like a river of blood. And Jesus is going, he went across that ravine and then into a garden that we know is the Garden of Gethsemane, and we know that this was a regular place for him to gather. And then all of a sudden, Judas leads a company of soldiers, and I looked this up, and it would have been, a true company would have been about 600 soldiers. They don't think that, most scholars don't think that there were that many of them because this garden is small. If you go to Israel and ever get the opportunity, this is a little garden. And so they think maybe at most around 200 guards. But think about this. Picture a quiet night, but in a swollen city. So I guess it wouldn't have been quiet, but just many people in Jerusalem for this festival, and all of a sudden you see 200 plus soldiers marching through the city with temple police. And so we're talking about Roman soldiers, but we're talking about Jewish temple police, and the Pharisees, they're carrying in lanterns, torches, and weapons. This would have been quite a scene, and I am just thinking human nature would have, it would have captured people's attention, and other people would have been drawn to follow them to see what was going on. But we can see from this, with the weapons and the torches and the amount of men, that they were expecting a fight. They were not expecting to capture Jesus and for this to go easily or smoothly. One of the things that Brad Gray, who leads my Turkey trips, and one of his teachings about Judas being a zealot, and we know this from the breakdown of his last name, is that he had a thought that what if Judas was not necessarily wanting to portray Jesus as wanting him to be captured and all of this, but what if he was wanting to put Jesus in a situation that would force him to take over his kingdom by force? And I thought that was just an interesting thought that, you know, Judas is thinking, oh, he has all this power. I've seen it. I've seen him do miracles. I will put him in a situation that's going to force him to rise up and overthrow the Jewish government and the Roman government. Just food for thought. We don't know this at all, but it's just conjecture, and it's interesting to think about. But they end up coming up to Jesus, and he asked them very calmly who they were looking for. And they ended up saying that they were looking for him, and he said, I am he. We see immediately that he is not avoiding arrest, and we know that he's in a familiar place, and so this is even voluntary. He knows Judas left his Passover meal to go do all of this, and so he goes to a familiar place where Judas is going to know where to find him. This is all orchestrated. He is obeying God's plan, and he is under full submission of his Father. So this is not the rulers of this world taking over Jesus. This is Jesus entering in and volunteering himself to be a sacrifice. We see that Simon Peter draws a sword, and he ends up striking the ear of the high priest's slave. And immediately Jesus rebukes him, and he heals the man. But we see this act of bravery, and we see that we realize that Peter still doesn't know the significance and the necessity of what Jesus is going to do on the cross. And so Jesus has given them clues along the way, but they haven't been able to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and they don't quite know what's going on. And so Jesus ends up turning himself over and saying that, telling even Peter, am I not supposed to drink the cup that my Father has given me? It says, then the company of soldiers and the commander and the Jewish temple police arrested Jesus and tied him up. Verse 13. First they led him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be advantageous that he be the one to die for the people. So we're going to talk about this very first stop that they make. The temple police, the guards, the Roman soldiers bring Jesus to Annas. Now, let's talk about the position of the high priest. The high priest was originally the supreme religious ruler in all of Israel. This started with Moses' brother Aaron, and it was hereditary, the way that God set this up. The high priest had to have no physical defects, and they had to be holy in conduct, and they would remain the high priest until death. They were the ones that they were the only ones allowed to enter the most holy place behind the veil in the temple courts, or in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was on the Day of Atonement. Their job would be to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat of the Ark to atone for the sins of the nation and to atone for the sins of the high priest himself. And this would be the only character and the only person that could even enter that room, and it could only be done once a year. And they would atone for the sins of the people. And this is a picture of what Jesus is later going to become for us. Jesus became, at his death, our high priest. We are allowed to go into God's presence now through Jesus, where before there was a veil. And so at this point in Jesus's day, the high priest system looked much differently. They were not holy in conduct. They were not, this was not a hereditary thing passed down from Aaron's line anymore. In fact, the Roman governor was able to appoint the high priest of their choosing. So this was very political. The high priest and the Roman governor would have worked together, and they would have scratched each other's backs. So at one point in time, Annas was the appointed high priest, but he had been deposed, and his son-in-law Caiaphas would have been set in place. So again, all of this is just a political facade, and it's not being operated like God had once designed mind. The reason why the people would have gone to Annas is many of them would have still looked at him as the legitimate high priest, since under Mosaic law, the high priest should have remained in his position until death. Jesus ends up messing up the high priest money-making schemes. Remember, earlier in the book of John, he goes through and he cleans out the temple because there were all of these people with their booths set up, and they were making money, and they were driving up the cost of buying a sacrificial lamb. They were selling it for a super inflated price to line their own pockets, but they also, when people would have brought their own Passover lambs, they had to pass the inspection of the high priest and the priests that worked for him. And so they were finding defects that weren't really there in order to force the people to buy their own animals. And so this was a huge money-making scheme that would align the pockets of everyone, including the high priest. And Jesus messed with all that. So he would have been an enemy of the high priest, and the high priests weren't fond. And I say weren't, they were not fond of him. I'm talking about Annas and Caiaphas as if they are both operating at the same time, because they both still had power. Now, it's going to jump from this to Peter all of a sudden, and we see in the IVP Bible background commentary that the changing of scenes back and forth was a standard suspense building technique in ancient literature. And so this is perfectly put. John is a great literary author, and he's going to go back and forth of what's happening with Jesus and what's happening with Peter, what's happening with Jesus and what's happening with Peter. So we see initially in verse 15, and it says, "Meanwhile, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple." Now, we do not know who this other disciple is. Tradition a lot of times lays it at John, the author, but we truly don't know that. But we do know this, that this other disciple, this not named disciple, was a disciple that was an acquaintance of the high priest. And so that disciple went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyards, but Peter remained standing outside by the door. Peter was not welcomed in because he was not known by the high priest's doorkeeper. But in verse 16 it says, "But Peter remained standing outside the door. So the other disciple, the one that knew the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper, and then brought Peter in." Now, in this courtyard, a lot of people would have been gathered around, standing by fires and keeping warm. And this is what is happening. It says that the slave girl who was the doorkeeper said to Peter, "You aren't one of the man's disciples too, are you?" And he says, "No, I'm not." Now, the slaves and the temple police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. And this was his first declaration that he did not know who Jesus was. Now the scene is going to switch back to Annas. And it says the high priest questioned Jesus and his disciples about his teaching. And Jesus' response was that he has spoken openly. He's taught in the synagogues and the temple complex, and he has done nothing in secret. All of these things would, if he would have done all of these things differently, then that would have been the mark of a false teacher. But he's saying he's done everything by the book. And then he ends up telling the high priest, "Why are you questioning me? Why don't you question other people who have been there?" And he gets slapped by temple police for being out of line. And I just, in my notes, I put, wow. Can you imagine being a human man and slapping the creator of the universe? Besides just shocking me as I read this would have been against Jewish law to treat a prisoner like this. Jesus ends up asking for the evidence that was against him, and Annas is going to, at this point, send Jesus to Caiaphas, who is the ruling high priest at this time. He wants Caiaphas to deal with this, and this likely would have been in the same compound. So they're just going to another room now, which John does not write what happens in his gospel, and so we're not, because of time scale, gonna look at that. Now the scene switches back to Peter, and in verse 25 it says, "Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him," just other people in the courtyard, You aren't one of the disciples too, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose Peter had cut off the ear, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter then denied it again, and immediately the rooster crowed. So we'll talk more about that later. So then we learn from the other Gospels that Caiaphas is going to send Jesus to Pilate. Now we're going to talk about who Pilate was, because you have all of this political red tape that is going on right now. Pilate is the governor of the area of Judea, and so he was the governor that would have ruled at this time in Jerusalem. He would have been in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, because anytime the city swelled, a Roman cohort needed to be there with the governor to ensure the peace. And Pilate was a governor that was already not in good terms with Rome and with Caesar. Just history through the writings of Josephus and some other writers, you find out that maybe he wasn't very good at what he did. And there was always these scuffles rising up between the Jewish people and Pilate, because he would allow things to happen that would have been against the Mosaic law, like bringing coins into the temple area that would have Caesar's face on it and stuff like that. So there were always these factions that would be rising up and wanting to overthrow a decision that Pilate made. And so there was this constant turmoil that made his life miserable, and it did not make him a fan of Caesar's and Rome. And so he was trying to keep the peace. The last thing that he wanted was this big revolt and this big thing to happen under his watch. Okay, so we start off by seeing that this is early in the morning, and all of these Jewish leaders did not want to go into Pilate's home for this conversation, because it was the Passover. If they would have entered a Gentile's home, they would have been made unclean and not be able to celebrate all of the things that they, and to be a part of the Passover meal. So Pilate comes out to them, but this is so interesting, and it just shows you what religiosity will do, because here they are wanting to be clean so that they could celebrate Passover, but they know that they are being so shady about Jesus's arrest, and they're trying to find all these loopholes that they can use to get him to stay arrested and to actually have a corporal punishment made against him. The Jewish leaders are upset with him, and they find him guilty of blasphemy, but they know that Pilate isn't going to care about this. He's a Roman city official, and he's not going to care about blasphemy against their law. And so they know that they have to put a spin on why they want him arrested. Also, they want him to be killed, but in 30 AD, Rome had taken away capital punishment from the Jews, which their capital punishment would have been stoning. But because that right was taken away from them, they knew he had to be found guilty in a Roman court of law so that they could administer their capital punishment, which would have been crucifixion. And so they need to find something that would make him guilty under Pilate's watch. And so they end up kind of spinning some things, and they say, well, he refuses to pay taxes, and he claims to be king, and all of these things are treasonous. And Pilate ends up questioning Jesus. He doesn't quite find him guilty. We see in another gospel that Pilate's wife had as a dream, and she urges Pilate to let this man go and to not get involved in this. And so Pilate is struggling with his own conscience, with the dream of his wife, and doing not necessarily the right thing because of Jesus, but he wants to do the right thing so that there is not this uproar and it will get him more in trouble with Caesar. So Pilate ends up finding out that that Jesus was a Galilean, and he's like, oh, whew. And we don't see this in this gospel, but in the others, and he sends him to Herod, because that's actually under Herod's jurisdiction. Herod would have been in town for the Passover, and so he's like, oh, you know what, guys, this is a decision that Herod needs to make, but we're going to see that Herod's going to send him right back to Pilate, and Pilate's going to have to make this decision. One of the loopholes that Pilate tries to use is that it is just a tradition that has evolved that on the Passover, the Roman governor will allow one of the Jewish prisoners to be set free. And so he thinks, oh, this is it. The people will vote and allow Jesus to be set free, but that backfires on him, and they actually want Barabbas, who is a horrible criminal, to be set free instead of Jesus. And so this is where it closes, and we'll pick up in the middle of this scene on what's going to happen next and what Pilate's going to have to decide in chapter 19. So I encourage you to stick with us. Let's read chapter 19 together. I'll see you next Thursday, and happy reading.